Hi class, it's Bill Berry here with a supplemental video for week 4 on preconditions. I'm getting a lot of questions about these and we want to make sure that we have these down before we move forward, as they'll be required pretty much the whole rest of the quarter. You'll just be expected to be able to deal with them and put them in when necessary. So let's cover them real quickly and talk about how they work, and you'll have hopefully a great idea of how to make everything work and when you shouldn't use them as well, which is a very important concept. So first of all, when do we need them? When do we put in preconditions? Well, first of all, we want to use these in supplier code, right? So when you're writing methods for a supplier class, you want to use preconditions. Remember that when you're writing supplier class, you are assuming that other humans are going to use this code. It's not code for you necessarily. It's code that you're going to supply to others to make use of. These others may not even have the source code. They may just have the bytecode, right? So they don't necessarily even see your code, but other people are using it. So that's an important piece. Also, we use these where there are critical assumptions about the parameters. So when someone calls your code, there are times when you simply must have data in a certain form. You must have things in a certain range or in a certain form, and there's nothing that you can really do that's good with data that's coming in that's in a bad form or in a bad range. So you basically, it's a stopper condition where data comes in and you just go, I have no idea what to do with this. There's nothing good for me to do. Also, we use them where there is no good way to communicate that the data is bad. So for instance, think about a method that returns a double. You pass it, let's say, one double and it returns a double. Well, you don't have any special signal data to use, right? It's not like a string where you could return error or some sort of thing that indicates a bad value, and you can't return -999 because that's a perfectly valid double. So you don't have any way in the return to say, hey, look, I didn't like this thing, so I'm just giving you this secret little error code. There's nothing like that. You could add an extra parameter that indicates whether the thing passed or failed, but that's really not what you want. That starts really littering up all your APIs with that kind of stuff. So that's not good either. So you really have no good way. Also then, we do it where you can tell the callers about the restrictions. This stuff shouldn't be a surprise, right? The precondition shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. So you tell them about these things via documentation, and we'll cover that in a minute. So you have to have told them about these things via, let's say, Java docs or some other documentation where you tell them. Then we use preconditions where callers can easily know their data is incorrect. For instance, if you're writing a function that takes a square root, you can tell the users, hey, you can't give me negative data, right? Negative numbers I can't take the square root of. It's just going to be problematic. So it's easy enough for them to say, oh, look, I can't pass a -2. If it blows up, well, I know why, because I passed it a -2. So that's easy enough to know. But sometimes it's a little harder. For instance, let's say you have a bank account object and you tell the user, look, you may never go below 0 on this particular kind of thing. Your account must never go below 0. Well, how can the user figure that out? The client code, how can they figure it out and make sure they don't attempt this operation? Well, they can check the current balance and they can check the amount that they're trying to withdraw from the account, and they can do the subtraction and make sure that it's not above or not negative after that. So one way or another, they have to either be able to know that their data is bad or easily find it out. So it can't be trickery, right? None of this is trickery, none of it's hidden. It's all out in the open so that client code is really clear about it. So nothing's a mystery here. So how do we code these things up? When we code a precondition, what do? Well, the main thing is that we throw exceptions. Remember, we have no good way to communicate back the error, so one of the typical things we do is we throw an error, an exception, and the calling code can catch that exception if they wish, or make sure they avoid the conditions, or both actually, right? It'd be smart of them to put it in a try catch just in case there's a problem anyway. But anyway, we throw exceptions as a precondition. Also, we tend to do this at the very top of the method because if the data is bad, there's no point going on. I've seen some students write a whole bunch of code where they do some work and then they test the precondition near the bottom. Well, you don't want to have to go undo that work, right? You don't want to have to take away values that you've added or accumulators and stuff like that. You don't want to do that. So you do it at the very, very top. It says, look, if the input data is bad, we're just going to throw the exception, right? No point going on. What does the typical code look like? Well, you do the test in an if statement and then you throw an error. And very typically we use something like illegal argument exception. And that you pass it a little string, right, a little message, so that the calling code can look at that if they wish and understand what they did wrong. So that's what these typically look like. Now notice that we have an if and then we have this first part, but we don't put an else. We typically don't write that. Why? Because when you throw an error, you're basically exiting from the method anyway, right? The error bails out of this code and goes back to the caller anyway. So you don't really have to write else and then continue the code. It's kind of implied that if it made it past the closing bracket of the if clause, it's okay. So we typically don't see an else clause. So that's what preconditions look like. It's an if with a test for the bad data and it throws an exception. Now, how do we document these things? If we have preconditions in there, what are the kind ways that we can tell folks that something can happen? Well, we basically mark the method as throwing an error. So in the method, like let's say we have one called square root, we write throws and we write illegal argument exception, which tells us, hey, this potentially, when you call this thing, it potentially does throw this error. So that's a way to document it on the actual method itself. And then we typically write an @throws tag for Java docs as well. And we say, hey, look, this thing throws an illegal argument exception. What that does is that makes sure that in the documentation view, they will actually see that as part of the API, right? As part of the documentation for this particular method. They will see that it potentially throws that, and they can say, I'm going to then put it in a try catch on my end to make sure if something goes wrong, I know how to handle it. So that's how we document them. Two things. We add the throws clause to the end of the method before the opening curly brace, and then we add the @throws tag so that the Java docs also picks that up. This is not required in terms of syntax in most cases, although you'll see in the future some places where it'll force you to do it, but this is the good way to make sure that the documentation is very clear. Next, how do we test these things? If we have a precondition, we want to make sure that when we write our test code, we test everything, including preconditions. The weird thing about test code that does preconditions, and by the way, in the week 3 examples on testing, there's an example of this that you should watch if you haven't. But note that the test code has to expect the error. The error is actually the right thing to have happen in this particular case, which is kind of weird. Normally we want to avoid errors, but test code needs to expect the error. So basically what we do in test code is that we put in a try-catch block the actual bad thing, right? So we try to call the method using data that we know is bad, like a -1 in this case. And then if the error is triggered, it'll take the catch block down here, and we don't put any code because that's exactly right? We expect that to have happen, so we actually don't need any code down there. The code that actually catches and displays the error message if the test fails is right here. Why? Because if it gets to that line, it's a problem, right? We expected the thing to throw the exception, which would have bailed out of the try code and would never get to this printf line. Actually, we don't need a printf. We wanted a print line. That's my mistake, sorry. So basically, that's the way the try-catch code looks for testing preconditions. You do the bad thing, right under the bad thing, you put a failure message, and then under the catch block, which you need because you expect the exception to be caught, you don't need to put any code because that's the pass case. So that's what testing looks like. And again, go back to week 3, and there's a module video on unit testing, and preconditions are discussed there. All right, so last but not least, when do we not use preconditions? Because this is a typical problem that students have when they're learning about this stuff. They start sprinkling these things in all over the place. But note that we never ever want to use preconditions in code that gathers any kind of user input. We never want to throw errors when it comes to responding to the user. Besides, we're actually gathering the data right now anyway, so why would we throw an error to the user which they have no way to handle? Instead, we have a perfect opportunity to just correct the thing right now. Just ask them for better data. So client code, especially client UI code, would never have preconditions in it, ever. right? So think about that again. Supplier classes tend to have them. Clients, but especially UI-based programs would not have these things. How do we deal with errors like that, right? Instead of having preconditions, what do we do for bad data coming in from the user? Well, we handle it, right? We do normal error handling. So we do data type checking using scanner look ahead, which I've demonstrated in videos, or you can put a try catch around a data type conversion that you attempt and just catch the error, and then we do that in a loop so that if we see bad data, we keep reprompting until the user complies. But again, never preconditions, right? Your normal course of business for anything that the user types in should never yield any kind of error. You should prevent that because you have code in place. You should have code in place to take care of that. So that's a quick overview of where you use preconditions, how they work, how they look, how you test them, and when not to use them. I'm hoping that that'll kind of help you as you move forward and you finish up Project 4 and you're preparing for the exam, the midterm exam as well, because these concepts will keep coming up on that exam, but also later in the quarter. So please let me know in the forums or in email if you have any other questions that haven't been answered here. And good luck with preconditions and objects in general, and we'll see you soon on forums or an email. Thanks.